Hello and welcome to the Crystal Palace podcast. I'm Alfonso Greenbrook, and in today's podcast I'll be looking over the game against Brighton by bringing you my match review, player rankings and my man of the match. As well as this, I'm also going to bring you interviews with Roy Hodgson, Luka Milivojevic and Aaron Wan-Bissaka after the game. So let's begin. Crystal Palace fell to defeat at the hands of Brighton Hove Albion for the second time this season in a frustrating clash under the sun in S3E38. In a cagey affair where Palace uncharacteristically owned the lion's share of possession, the visitors won with goals either side of a Luka Milivojevic penalty to claim 6 points in total from the claws of the Eagles. Perhaps as an intensive rivalry is expected to be, the game started in fiery fashion when Anthony Knockaert saw yellow within a minute after an aggressive lunging tackle on Palace captain Milivojevic. Michy Batshuayi registered the afternoon's first shot on target as he dug out an effort at Matt Ryan's goal. However, his shot deflected tamely into the Australian international's arms. With Palace on top, it was against a run of play that the visitors netted the game's opening goal. As James Tompkins failed to connect with a header intended for Vicente Guaita, Glenn Murray raced with the Eagles centre-back towards the goal line. Deftly stretching out his leg, Murray hit the ball in the volley from the edge of the box past the Spanish keeper, with Tompkins left flagging as the loser of their battle. Looking to haul his side level, Wilfried Zaha was denied as he struck an effort from a crowded penalty area, which Lewis Dunk deflected just wide of Ryan's goal. From the resulting corner, Tompkins sent a cleared ball back inside the box, with Jeffrey Slapp hit emphatically on the rotation, though his effort bounced wide. Minutes before the half-time whistle blew, Palace launched an assault on the Seagulls' box, but Batshuayi and James McArthur both squandered potential chances, and the home side entered the break a goal down. Opening the second half, Jaban threatened the Eagles when he released a dipping shot at goal. Despite the ball's unnerving bending flight path, Guaita got two hands behind it and maintained a tight scoreline. But Palace were determined to not let the visitors extend their lead further and pulled themselves level when David Propper brought down Andros Townsend in the Seagulls' box. Stepping up as coolly as ever in spite of the interfering winds, Milivojevic buried his side's goal to bring the Eagles firmly back into the game. Nestling into the back of the net, the captain's spot kick seemed to blow the match open, and the Eagles looked like a side with lifted confidence playing with the backing of an energised Selhurst Park. But their sustained spell of possession didn't once seriously threaten Ryan's goal, and Palace, along with their fans, were left frustrated as several promising runs fizzled out with defensive clearances of well-missed efforts. Milivojevic came closer to doubling his and his side's tally when he unleashed a shot just wide of goal. Yet it was the visitors who were celebrating next when Knockaert picked up the ball from distance on the right and, having skipped past his way closer to the box, launched an impressive shot into Palace's inner netting. Looking to replicate his teammate's strike, Jahanbakhsh took aim and fired from 25 yards, but his effort dipped just over Guaita's bar. In an attempt to steal a point at the death, Slapp blazed over from 10 yards as the Eagles were left to concede defeat. So now I'm going to move on to the player ratings, but before I start, don't forget you can follow us on both Twitter and Facebook at Crystal Palace for all the latest Palace news. So if you're someone like myself who does like to follow a vast array of Palace accounts on both Twitter and Facebook, then of course do head over there and follow our respective pages. Now whilst we obviously post just general Palace news, whether that be about the ins and goings at the club, whether that be about the academy or the ladies team, we obviously do regularly update it with the latest transfer news, so especially sort of in the coming towards the end of the season with, of course, new contracts and things like that coming up, and of course the possibilities of what could happen ins and outs in the summer. Of course do follow us because we do regularly update it with the latest transfer news, and I would say personally, not obviously trying to brag, but we are very good at sourcing these articles and putting them out as soon as we find them. So if you are someone who obviously wants to follow us for the latest news, but in particular the transfer news, of course feel free to do so. Alongside that, and alongside the fact that we just do the general club news, we obviously do post interviews as well. So if you are someone, once again, who just wants to keep up to date, whether that be player interviews, manager interviews, whether it be just interviews with maybe even pundits and what they think about Palace's situation, anything like that, is all sort of the sort of news we sort of cover. And even alongside the news, we also post our own opinion on there. So whilst I give you guys my opinion in the podcast, we also have a few guys running the Twitter account. So if you are someone who wants to get sort of instant match reaction or even reaction sort of after the game or during the week, where you can sort of we can have discussions about the lineup or after the game, given that instant reaction. If you are someone who wants another place to get an opinion, as well as someone to get the news, then of course our Twitter and Facebook pages are of course the places to go. So of course, once again, you can follow them at Crystal Palace. Now, another great place for you guys to share your opinion is in YouTube comments. So if you are listening to the podcast on YouTube, then do feel free to drop a comment below the video with your player ratings, where you rate the players' performances from 1 to 10, and that's of course with 10 being the best. And the main reason I want you to do that is just so that rather than me just having my general view of the game, I can come back to the comment section and read what you guys thought, how you thought the players performed. And when you consider it was a very lacklustre performance from both teams, very disappointing on Palace's behalf in the fact that we had loads of possession, couldn't take advantage of that, and even though Brighton were playing essentially with 9 to 10 men behind the ball, whichever way you look at it, it was really difficult to break them down. But that doesn't really excuse our defending and our lack of creating and finishing chances. So overall, obviously there's going to be a lot of bad ratings, but of course feel free to share them nonetheless. So essentially that's just so that I've got my view of the game, I can read your comment section and sort of build up a bigger opinion of the game. And even if you don't want to do that, or even if you're a Brighton fan, obviously I don't know why you would be here, but if you are a Brighton fan, obviously comment below with your general views of the game. So what you thought about the goal, is that Brighton's goal of the season? And obviously in a Palace perspective, how disappointing was it to lose to Brighton? Not only the way we did in terms of just how bad both teams were playing and we were just worse, but also the fact that they've done the double over us. And of course, in terms of this result here, obviously it's not going to do much for our morale, but of course we've got the big game against Watford coming up, so of course we're going to have to pick ourselves up there. So if you do have if you obviously want to share your player ratings, of course feel free to do so, but also just feel free to comment below with your general views of the game, what you think this result might do, and obviously whether you do think what we could have done better in the game. And of course there's been quite a lot of debate on Twitter, so of course feel free to share that. Now, like I've said already, alongside me obviously coming to the comment section, any other fans who come to the video, whether they be Palace or Brighton fans, rather than them just listening to me go on about the game and go on about players' performances, they can read the comment section as well, just so we can have a little bit of a discussion. And alongside that, if you do have any questions for me or anything you sort of think I might be saying which is wrong, or anything you might disagree with, of course feel free to comment that below as well, because of course I'm very active as well, so I do like to have discussions with you lot. So if you do want to follow any of the social media pages or join the Facebook group, then do check all links that will be in the description below. So I'm now going to move on to the player ratings, starting and goal with Vicente Gaeta, who I'm going to give a 5 overall. Now, of course, before I go on to talk about his performance against Brighton, which of course I've given him a 5, so it wasn't necessarily that great, I might as well talk about the fact that he was a topic of discussion last weekend after the game against Burnley, and that's just because he got dropped for Wayne Hennessy. And I talked quite a lot in depth last week about that Hennessy was played in that game because he brought height, and that's what we needed in terms of coping with the threat that Burnley had. So understandably, even though we were quite annoyed because Gaeta is quite clearly the better goalkeeper, and certainly in terms of the one goal that Burnley scored, I'm sure Gaeta would have saved it. But in terms of the height, and that was the main issue that Burnley posed teams, I think it was the right decision. So coming here against Brighton, even though they have height up top, it was a slightly different team. So I do understand, Gaeta getting recalled to the side, obviously after missing out last weekend. And obviously, incidentally, that sort of coincided with the fact that Hennessy was injured. He wasn't in the squad overall, but I think that was sort of a last minute injury. So it wasn't the fact that he was dropped totally from the squad, or the fact that the FA have banned him, which I personally thought, but obviously we found out later on that he was injured. But nevertheless, I do think it was the right decision. Whether or not Hennessy was fit, obviously he had the injury, but even if he was fit or not, I do think Gaeta, deserves to get his place back in the squad. Not because Hennessy was necessarily bad against Burnley, just because I think that in terms of the opposition, Gaeta would have done a better job. But one of the reasons I've given him a 5 overall is mainly because quite early on in the game, he was virtually a spectator for that half, and that was just mainly because obviously Palace, we were quite lacklustre in the game. We weren't really getting into it. We were having loads of possession, but weren't really doing anything with it. Whereas Brighton, on the other hand, weren't necessarily playing that great, but at least the few chances they did have didn't really trouble Gaeta. So realistically, give him a 5, especially because of that first half, mainly because he was a spectator. And the only thing that really he did see in terms of chances that Brighton had through on goal was of course Glenn Murray's finish. Obviously Roy Hodgson talked about the wind, and the wind sort of from Brighton's goal kick. Obviously the wind's taken the ball over. Glenn Murray, obviously we know the quality he's got because he used to play for us, but it's obviously so annoying that he scores against us. The wind's taken the ball down. James Tompkins has missed a header, and obviously Glenn Murray's gone through and hit it on the volley and opened the scoring in the first half. So realistically for me, looking at that first half, Gaeta was spectator for the most part of it, because really Obviously, Palace were much the same as Brighton in the fact that we weren't really playing that great, weren't really creating chances. But of course, the one real chance that Brighton had, they scored it. But of course, you know, me looking back at it, Gaeta couldn't really do too much about that. Now, obviously, going into the second half, there were a few saves that Gaeta made, and obviously a few claims as well, you know, in terms of getting down low and getting to balls. So that was all good about his game. But, you know, there was one save in particular from Johan Bach, I think that's how you say his name, and literally come out from the second half. Immediately after that, he's obviously had a shot for a goal, and Gaeta made quite a comfortable save, but nonetheless a save which you want a goalkeeper to make, because if you concede a goal right after half time, of course that's going to kill any potential momentum that you could build. And of course, you know, in the first half, we saw Glenn Murray's goal go in. Couldn't really do too much about that. The same with Anthony Knockaert's goal. As much as we hate him as Palace fans, we don't like him at all. He obviously scored a great goal. Got to put my hands up and go, great goal in terms of cutting inside and putting it top corner. Nothing Gaeta could do about it. You know, even though he stretched, he couldn't really get there. And obviously I'll go on to talk about who I personally will blame for that goal later on. But like I've said already, couldn't do anything about the either goals. You know, the Glenn Murray one was just a mistake from James Tompkins, and of course the Knockaert one was a mistake by Patrick Ronaldo and into the top corner. Can't really say anything about that. But I've got to give him credit for that save he made from Johan Bach in particular. But I suppose, you know, looking at the game overall, you know, I've given him a 5 because he was other than the goals, he was essentially a spectator for the whole game. You know, other than making a few saves here and there and a few claims, don't really think there's too much of note to talk about his performance. And I suppose the phrase you could use is strange afternoon, because that's exactly what it was. It's that he didn't have anything much to do, but he still had to pick the ball out of his net twice, and that's not a reflection of his bad goalkeeping. It's just the fact that throughout the whole game, didn't really have anything to do, but then the only time he did have something to do was the goals we conceded, and they weren't really his fault. So I do think overall a 5 is a fair reflection. Maybe, you know, there were other times in the game, not necessarily to do with his goalkeeping, but in terms of his distribution, that maybe could have been a little bit better. You know, not only actually just pumping the ball along and then balls being a bit more accurate, but in terms of just releasing the ball quickly. And that was something me sitting in the stands going, why are we not passing it out from back? Why are we just holding on to the ball, waiting for the team to reshape? We need to, or waiting for Brighton to reshape. What we should have done, as soon as we get the ball, pass it out and hit them on the counter-attack. But instead, we were taking our time, playing the ball out from the back, or taking goal kicks, which ultimately either got intercepted by Brighton or, you know, went out. So realistically, even though I think he had the right performance, I just think that maybe them little things, the fact that we had loads of possession, the fact that both teams were terrible, if one thing like the distribution had been a little bit better and allowed us to hit teams on the counter-attack, then maybe something would have happened differently. But overall, Vicente Gaeta coming back into the side, didn't do too much wrong, didn't do anything fantastic, so I do think overall the 5 is a fair result. So I'm going to move on now to the first player in our defence, and that is the right back Aaron Wan-Bissaka, who I'm going to give a 7 overall. Now, to be honest, I've given him a 7 because once again he's impressed me, and you know, I'm honestly, being honest with myself, I do repeat myself quite a lot every week, because Wan-Bissaka constantly, very consistently just produces these high level of performances. And you know, when you consider it was a lacklustre performance across the whole team, he was one of the only players to actually come out with credit, and that's just because defensively he was very solid, you know, making tackles, making blocks. And in terms of going forward, even though, you know, we had people like Wilf, like Townsend on the pitch, quite a lot of the time, most of our attacking outlets actually came from Wan-Bissaka, which really just goes to show how bad the rest of the team was in this game, or how lacklustre they were, and also just how good Wan-Bissaka is starting to go. Now, in terms of the first half, you know, in particular, looking at that half, I think that Wan-Bissaka saw quite a lot of the ball down that right-hand side, and that's not just because, you know, let's say Brighton were giving us loads of possession. It's just the fact that most of our attacks were concentrated down the right hand side. So it was a mixture between Palace ultimately trying to, you know, go on the overlap down that right hand side, put the ball into the box, and of course mainly down to Brighton giving us so much possession and just, you know, happens to be on that right hand side. So there's a mixture of things there why Wan-Bissaka was involved quite a lot in the first half in particular. But the thing that was really lacking, and this is something which we saw last week against Burnley, you know, the fact that he made or created a fantastic assist for Batshuayi. Looking back at this game here, that was the thing that was just missing from his game, because the amount of time he was on the ball, the amount of time he was running down that right flank, if he had just had that chance or had sort of that ability just to find that final ball like he done last weekend, then maybe something else could have happened and maybe we would have been able to create a few more chances. But overall, even though that final ball was lacking, it of course was impressive to see him playing so high up the pitch, you know, looking to get the ball on that left hand side. And to be honest, it's nice to actually be talking about his attacking play more so than his defensive play, because that's so good now, that's so consistently good, that actually I'd much rather talk about how he's developing going forward as well. And you know, ultimately modern day fullbacks, that's sort of their secondary job in terms of getting forward and helping the attacks. Now, obviously, there were two occasions where Brighton had, you know, really great attacks down that side. Obviously, you know, that was mainly to us sort of trying to get back into the game. We're pressing quite high. Brighton then hit us on the counter-attack, and of course Wan-Bissaka, like he normally does, made two vital interceptions to obviously thwart these two attacks, and that was just shortly after the break. So once again, you know, even though we were in the ascendancy in terms of possession, in terms of chances, and the fact that we got it back to 1-1, we were in that ascendancy. Even though that was the case, we were leaving ourselves a little bit exposed at the back, and of course Brighton exposed that in terms of going on the counter-attack. But of course Wan-Bissaka, like he normally does, was able to make a number of vital interceptions to of course thwart these attacks. But overall, I do think these 7 I've given him is a fair result. Obviously comment below with your thoughts. And to be honest, that's all I can really say about Wan-Bissaka's performance, just because, quite purely, he was one of the best players on the pitch, and that's just because when all of the other players around him were playing quite average, he of course was one of the standout players. So I do think overall this 7 is a fair result, and to be honest, other than the fact that he made loads of interceptions, loads of tackles throughout the game, and once again, you know, I talked about stats last week, once again had an outstanding stats across the field. You know, there isn't really too much more to say there, but you know, like I've said, a player, I've given him a 7 just because he's one of the few players who actually comes out of the game with any credit. So I'm now going to move on to the first of our 2 centre-backs, and that is James Tomkins, who I'm going to give a 5 overall. Now, before I go on to talk about Tompkins' performance, I've got to talk about the fact that ever since Mamadou Sakho's got injured, there seems to be a little bit of a drop in Tompkins' performances. Now, whether that's just the fact that he's not playing alongside Sakho and maybe he doesn't feel as comfortable, you know, playing with Dan or Kelly, or whether it's just the fact that he's going through a bad run of form, it obviously is quite obvious and quite clear to see that at the minute he's not necessarily playing to the standards that he set, you know, before Sakho got injured, and certainly throughout the whole season. And, you know, looking at Wan-Bissaka and, you know, and comparing them, these two are two very consistent players. And of course, James Tomkins, all this season he's been very consistent in terms of very high quality performances, but of course in the last sort of few games or so he's been, you know, not, I wouldn't say bad, but he's been slightly worse in terms of, you know, the high standards that he set earlier on in the season. Now, in terms of the 5 I've given him overall, it was mainly down to the fact that he was at fault for the first goal we conceded. And when you consider against your rivals a really big game, you know, you really have got to make sure you clear your headers, you clear your lines properly. And ultimately he didn't do that, and after 20 minutes we were already 1-0 down. Now obviously Roy Hodgson talked about the wind, and you know, I personally, you know, I've talked to people who said, you know, I've laughed at Jurgen Klopp for blaming the wind, but actually Roy Hodgson came out and said the same thing. And to be honest, I'm not going to go down that line because it was a absolute poor clearance from James Tomkins. But of course the wind didn't help. Obviously meant that James Tomkins misjudged the ball ever so slightly, the flight of the ball, and it was obviously a long ball over the top. And of course, because of that little bit of hesitation in terms of misjudging it, hitting it too wrong, the ball, he hasn't headed the ball's gone to Murray's path, and of course Murray was able to hit it on the counter-attack. And of course we know how good Murray is, you know, we know he can hit balls on the volley, but the fact that he was able so freely to get on the end of the ball because Tomkins failed to make that clearance and that header was of course a little bit disappointing. And you know, at that point, you know, both teams weren't necessarily playing great, and it was sort of like a really dead game in terms of the quality. No teams were really showing anything other than the fact that, you know, Palace had more possession, but maybe Brighton were a little bit more potent on the counter-attack. So really the beginning of the game wasn't that great, but the fact that Brighton had that advantage because of the fact that James Tomkins made that mistake by not making that header was a little bit disappointing. And you know, it is disappointing even more so, not just because of that goal in particular, but because last weekend against Burnley he was so good at, you know, clearing, winning all of these aerial duels, heading the ball away. So actually in comparing, you know, a performance, you know, from one weekend to the next, you know, you've gone from one extreme where you were winning all of the balls, winning every header, to where you're actually making mistakes where actually you missed a header and it ended up costing you. So whilst, you know, there are other reasons why we lost this game, you've got to look at Tomkins' defensive mistake there and go, actually he was obviously one of the reasons why we ended up losing the game, just because obviously he didn't make that simple clearance. And you know, that's ultimately why I've given him the 5 overall. Now, to be honest, the one thing I'm going to give him a little bit of credit for is just the fact that he didn't let that mistake faze him. And I suppose it goes back to the fact that he's got loads of experience, he's got that, yeah, he's just got that sort of experience, and he's got that them sort of qualities about him where he's that warrior, he can carry on, doesn't really let anything, you know, distract him from what he's doing, and ultimately that's what we saw in the rest of the game. But I've given him a 5 just because of that mistake, and the fact that even though he didn't let him phase him and he didn't let that sort of affect the rest of the game, for the remainder of the game, obviously he had that sort of in the back of his mind. And, ultimately, he's going to look at himself and go, one of the reasons we lost this is not just because of how badly we were playing as a team, but actually his individual mistake, which, you've got to look at the season as a whole and go, actually, he hasn't made many mistakes this season, but of course this one was one of the most costly ones, obviously against our rivals, but of course a win which could have taken us, even higher up the league. But like I've said already, in terms of the mistake as a whole, he hasn't made many mistakes this season, but this one was costly because it meant that we were chasing the game. Because, like I've said, the game was pretty dead at 0-0, no real quality from either side. So the fact that we actually just gave Brighton the advantage, which allowed us to, or allowed them to get ahead in the game, and allowed us, or didn't allow us, but meant that we were chasing the game, was of course a little bit disappointing. But overall, James Tompkins here, he's been very good this season, but maybe this is a slight off game, and that's why I've given him a 5. But I do think, do comment below with your thoughts, but I do think the fact that Mamadou Sakho is out injured and he hasn't got his normal partner, maybe that's having something to do with his performances. But then when you compare it to Burnley last week, he was absolutely fantastic there. So whatever it is, whatever was affecting Tompkins' performance, whether it be the change in his partner or whether it just be a bad run of form, hopefully we'll see a lot better performances from him in the coming weeks. But overall, I do think the 5 is a fair result. So I'm now going to move on to his centre-back partner, and that is Scott Dann, who I'm going to give a 6 overall. Now, to be honest, I'm going to give him a 6, mainly just because of just how, I wouldn't say he was brilliant in the game, but just because in terms of, comparing him to Tompkins made that mistake, it cost us, whereas Dan, I think, consistently throughout the game was consistently average, done what he had to do at the back, and I do think the 6 does reflect that. Now, I suppose, once again, going back to Tompkins, going back to Dan, these are two very experienced defenders, and I suppose you look back at the game against Brighton at the beginning of the season, Tompkins lost his head, we made loads of mistakes, whereas in this game here, it was only a mistake from Tompkins, and actually, I thought that throughout the whole game, I did think Scott Dann showed his experience by the fact that he was able to deal with people like Murray, deal with, the threats that Brighton had. So the fact that, Dan is one of the players, once again, like Wan-Bissaka, to come out of the game with not necessarily much credit, because of course we still conceded the 2 goals, but in terms of the back 4, you've got to argue that he's got to be, one of the ones least at fault for the goals we conceded, just because I think overall, he was a solid performance from him. But, when you consider that, Brighton like to play, even though Glenn Murray wasn't meant to start the game, obviously Brighton like to pump balls long, try to get the ball as much as they can to Murray, and we saw that throughout the whole game. Whether Murray was drifting out wide to pick up the ball, whether he was driving down the middle, Brighton were always looking to get the ball to him. So the fact that Scott Dann done relatively well in terms of dealing with him one-on-one and actually limiting him to very few chances after his early goal was good to see. So the fact that Glenn Murray had that confidence of scoring the goal, the fact that Scott Dann was ultimately able to stop that and say, and basically stop any of the chances or any further chances he had, was of course good to see. So for me, really, there isn't really too much more to say other than the fact that it was just a fairly solid performance, and a performance where Scott Dann showed his experience. And for me, even though it wasn't the greatest performance from the whole team, you've got to look at Dan's performance and go, actually, yes, he wasn't that great, but he was sort of average in the game and done a shift for the side. And I suppose if we're going to have a player who's not going to necessarily play sort of your 7s or 8s out of 10, I'd rather than just have a consistent 6 performance, didn't put a foot wrong, didn't do anything fantastic, and that's exactly what we got from Dan. So not really much more to say here, but I do think the 6 is a fair result. So I'm now going to move on to the final player in our back 4, and this is of course the left back Patrick Van Aanholt, who I'm going to give a 5 overall. Now, some of you may disagree with the 5 I've given him, and ultimately that's sort of reflective of his season as a whole, in the fact that this was yet again another disappointing performance from him, and not just because of the goal we conceded, but aside from the goal, which of course he was at fault for, I just think his general play in the game was a little bit disappointing. And I suppose I would accept, and I would be, I would think it's fair if some people did give him a 4, because his performance wasn't necessarily that great. Now, in terms of his forward play, I might as well talk about one of the few positives from his game. And actually, when opportunities did arrive down that left-hand side, he obviously did get forward, and, that's what we want to see from him, and that's something he's been lacking this season in terms of that attacking threat. But of course, he had to actually be wary of Knockaert, who was obviously looking to exploit that space he was leaving him behind. So whilst Van Aanholt was actually looking to get forward and looking to be positive in terms of an attacking threat, he obviously had to be very careful, because Knockaert, in terms of his game management, he was being very wary of where Van Aanholt was positioned, and quite a lot of the time when Van Aanholt had gone quite far forward, if Brighton did hit us on the counter-attack, which they did a few times, obviously Knockaert was one of these players who was able to get in these spaces, which obviously did arise from Van Aanholt playing so far forward. And that ultimately we've seen that quite a lot this season, where opposition players have exploited the space that we've left in behind. And obviously it isn't great when you've got left back like Van Aanholt, who's having quite a terrible season in terms of his standards. But in the last few weeks or so, I've given him a little bit of credit, saying yes, he's not necessarily great going forward, but defensively he's still doing a shift. Whereas this performance here was a complete reversal to when he sort of first drawn the club, or even what Sunderland fans said about him, where he can get turned inside and he isn't really that great defensively. So whilst in the last few weeks or so I've been saying he's getting better, his defensive performance have been consistent, but his offensive performance haven't been. This was sort of a step backwards, because his performance was sort of back to his best. And to be honest, you're looking at Knockaert's chances he had. He obviously got in behind quite a lot in the game, and of course the one chance that Knockaert did have, or the one real chance, he obviously finished it with ease. Obviously Van Aanholt, this was a schoolboy error. He shouldn't be letting Van Aanholt shouldn't be letting Knockaert actually come on the inside of him. Instead, he shows him that side, he goes around him. Obviously Knockaert cuts inside and obviously puts it in top bins to make it 2-1. So whilst I've given Van Aanholt quite a lot of credit this season in terms of his defensive play, yes, the offensive side of it's been lacking, but the offensive play's been good. Actually, this game here is a complete example of what. So I suppose it's a real summary of his season, in the fact that he just hasn't been that great, and that was just a real schoolboy error, just letting Knockaert go inside like that and obviously put it into the top corner. Now, of course, take nothing away from Knockaert, as much as we don't like him as Palace fans, that was a great goal for him. But if because he was beaten far too easily in the build up to that, ultimately meant that we went 2-1 down. And I do think at that point, if it had been 1-1, and even sort of going into the last sort of few minutes or so, if it had been 1-1, maybe Palace would have had that chance to get back into the game, because we were obviously in the ascendancy. But because obviously we had that goal disadvantage, essentially meant that there was no real chance for us to get back into the game. And ultimately, it was really disappointing overall. But just going back to Knockaert, obviously aside from the goal he scored, which of course is going to be up there as one of the goals of the month in terms of just the quality, in terms of cutting inside and the placement of the ball. And one of the reasons why it was quite inevitable that Knockaert was going to do something in the game is just because he was always looking to get on the ball for Brighton, and especially looking to get the ball on his left foot. And when you've got someone like Van Aanholt who's off his game, not going, not necessarily marking tight enough the opposition players, then of course something's going to come from it. So the fact that he didn't get too tight to him, didn't get close to his marker, ultimately meant that Palace paid the price at the end as the ball went in off the post. So throughout the game you could see the theme slowly building, the fact that Knockaert was getting all that freedom, getting in that space in behind, and of course that one chance he got it onto his left foot, put it into the top corner, and that was all down to Van Aanholt not obviously marking his or closing down his marker close enough. So overall, I don't really want to dwell too much more on it, because like I've said already, I've talked quite a lot this season in the fact that his performances have been a little bit hot and cold. But once again, another subpar performance, which I think does deserve the 5. And arguably, I wouldn't think it's harsh if people do give him a 4, because that mistake is such a schoolboy error that even sort of a non-league left back or right back will know that you don't let your players on your inside. But overall, I do think the 5 is a fair result. So I'm now going to move on to our first midfielder, and that is James McArthur, who I'm going to give a 6 overall. Now obviously James McArthur, even though the whole team performance was quite disappointing, McArthur was one of these players who showed a bit of tenacity, a little bit of fight in the game, and obviously in comparison to his teammates more so. So I do think McArthur, looking back at his performance here, yes, I've given him a 6, but actually in comparison to some of his teammates, at least it looked like he was putting in a shift in the game, and that was one of the reasons why I didn't necessarily give him lots of credit after the game, because his performance was still not up to standard, but I still think, in comparison to his teammates, it was a lot better. Now, one of the reasons why I was quite impressed with his performance was just because of the sheer amount of running he was doing in the game. So, obviously, looking back at the game, you're looking at the highlights, it was quite obvious to see Brighton were playing quite a high line, looking to put a lot of pressure on us, and ultimately that meant that people like McArthur had to run their socks off, trying to sort of counter that by running at the Brighton back four, running at even the Brighton midfielders, running at them, trying to break them down to sort of counter their high press, they were doing it. And ultimately, because he was full of this running, because he kept, running at the opposition, he actually took up quite a lot of good positions in advanced position, good positions quite far up the pitch. And that was just mainly down to the fact that because he was pushing so high up the pitch, he obviously found himself in really good positions. And, even though we had loads of shots, we had more shots than Brighton in the game, we had more possession in the game, the fact that we couldn't quite take advantage of that was maybe down to the team as a whole not playing good. But when you've got people like MacArthur getting into good positions, making good runs, is obviously quite disappointed that no one else was sort of able to finish them off. Now, there was one in particular which was one that was quite impressive, and ultimately he could have recorded yet another assist this season when he obviously passed for Zaha, looked to set through on goal to get the equaliser for Palace, but of course, Brighton made a fantastic block. So there was a prime example where actually all of that hard work and that good work MacArthur was putting in by pushing high up the pitch, being full of running, getting into good positions, it almost paid off if Brighton hadn't have made that sort of brilliant block to obviously stop Zaha going through on goal. And it just goes to show that yes, we were terrible in the game, but we had a few chances, but maybe it was just a mixture of the fact that Brighton wanted it more, luck maybe wasn't on our side, whatever it was, obviously it was a disappointing performance overall. Now, obviously on the stroke of half-time, obviously we were 1-0 down at this point, we're trying to get back into the game. He obviously had a chance himself to get on the score sheet, but obviously saw that effort deflected wide for a corner right on the stroke of half-time, and of course from the resulting corner nothing really did come from it. So not only in that first half was he positive in terms of his running, but actually in terms of providing for his teammates, that chance for Zaha, as well as having a chance for himself, which of course deflected wide from the corner. He obviously was, even though he wasn't great, he was sort of the centre point of all of our good play throughout the game. Now, I suppose in the second half, he had such a positive first half, maybe I probably would have given him a 7, but the reason I've given him a 6 overall is just because after half time, his passing was a little bit lacking, it was a bit slack in comparison to his first half performance, and of course, once Brighton took the lead, we obviously needed a bit more impetus to get back into the game, and of course MacArthur was taken off. Now, I don't think it was necessarily because he was playing bad, because like I've said, there were many players who were worse than him on the field, but I just think, we needed that fresh legs in the side, and of course that's why he was taken off. But overall, I do think this 6 is a fair result from MacArthur, when you consider all of that good work in the first half, making these runs, getting into good positions, passing to the likes of Zaha whilst also having his own chances. But the fact that he faded a little bit in the second half is why I've given him a 6 overall. And like I've said, even though I've given him a 6, you've got to give him a little bit more credit than other players, just because it looked like he looked like he wanted something more in comparison to the other players. He was looking to get forward. So even though we were quite lacklustre in terms of our team performance, it was nice to see MacArthur actually looking to do positive things for the side, in terms of getting in these good positions as well. And when you consider he's sort of very much a Marmite player this season, where some people want him in the team, some people don't, obviously like and dislike him. I do think a performance like this just goes to show that if the whole team had actually helped him and made good use and utilised the good work he was doing and playing off that, then maybe there would have been a different result there. But overall, I do think the 6 for James MacArthur is a fair result. So now I'm going to move on to the captain, Luka Milivojevic, who I'm going to give a 7 overall. Now, I suppose before I go on to talk about his performance, I might as well just talk about the game overall, before I go on to talk about just little details about his game, and actually go, some people might criticise me for giving him a 7 and saying I'm rating him too highly, but the fact that his midfield performance, much like MacArthur's, was full of tenacity, he was looking to get things involved, and like I've said, in comparison to other players in the team, it looked like he was up for the fight a little bit more. But then on the other hand, maybe if some of his midfield play could have been better, making a few more challenges or so, and of course his passing was something which I personally did not like in the game, kept passing sideways rather than going forward. So of course there's both sides to the story, some of his good parts in terms of his midfield play, and of course his passing going backwards and sometimes not making challenges on the other. So of course there's both sides to the argument, but I do think the 7 overall is quite a fair result, when you consider all of the good work he done and the fact that under that pressure, of that derby match, he was still able to score the penalty. Yes, it didn't mean anything for Palace, but at least we got the goal, and at least he proved once again how reliable he is from the spot to score that goal. Now, obviously, very early on in the game, obviously he was involved in the wars, obviously with it being a rivalry, derby game as you such, don't say the M23 derby because that's not what it's called, but derby, rivalry, whichever way you look at it. Obviously, you're always going to get in flying challenges, and right at the start of the game, Anthony Knockaerts made a very dangerous challenge. Obviously they're both going for the ball, which maybe that's why the referee did give it a yellow card. But when you look back at the replays, Knockhart's legs were off the ground. He was looking to studs up, into Luca. And yes, ultimately they were both going for the ball, but that was quite a malicious tackle. And the fact that we're literally 1 minute in the game, a play's been booked, and someone's almost got injured, within the first few seconds or so, really just goes to show sort of how heated the game was, and also how up for it Brighton were, because I didn't see any Palace players making challenges like that, which just goes to show, we didn't really seem up to it in comparison to Brighton. But the fact that he got up from that, I was sitting in the crowd and, I was thinking, that looked terrible. I thought he's going to go off injured. It's going to completely collapse our performance. But actually, he was able to come off, run it off, and continue to play. Which, once again, having that sort of warrior mentality to carry on despite taking a really heavy challenge like that was, of course, great to see. And rightly so, Anthony Knockaert got a yellow card. And, I'm not really going to say it definitely should have been a red card, but on another day, that probably would have been given. The fact that his studs were up, the fact that he was already on the ground while sliding into Luca, there's all different things. I'm not really going to dwell on it, but, you could argue that. And I think Sky Sports on Snapchat done a poll as to whether people think it should have been a yellow card, whether it should have been a red card. And actually, I think it was something like 63% said it should have been a red card. So, of course, there is a consensus that it could have been a red card. But like I said already, even if he had been sent off, we don't play well against 10 men. And also, I just think our performance was so bad that actually it wouldn't have made any difference overall. Now, a few minutes later, he once again got clipped by Bissouma. So once again, Luca's been involved in the game for bad reasons, and the fact that he's on the end of some nasty challenges. Obviously, he got clipped by him. This wasn't as nasty as the first one. But nevertheless, it just goes to show sort of that atmosphere within the game, in the fact that all Brighton just wanted it more than us, making these challenges. And of course, Luca got on the wrong end of them. Yes, once again, he didn't get injured, which of course was a good thing to see. But, challenges like this, you're taking them on. And yes, it's nice to see him get back up. But, one day this might not work and he might not be able to get up again. Might have to go off injured. So whilst it's good to see him have that warrior mentality, it obviously wasn't nice to see him actually being on the end of some nasty challenges. But I suppose in terms of the fact that he had to put up by getting on the end of these challenges, he obviously made up for it and got the revenge by equalising from the penalty spot, obviously in the second half. And that was obviously following Andros Townsend getting fouled in the box. Now there's a few Brighton fans saying, "Oh, it wasn't a penalty. We probably should have had a penalty up the other end." Personally, for me, you've took Townsend down on the edge of the box, quite a clear penalty. If you ask me, you take the player down. And ultimately, like I said already, the fact that Luca had that calmness to, within the circumstances, actually take the penalty, slot it home, and continue his great record for Palace. I think it's 21 goals now in his sort of 2.5 seasons at Palace, and I think it's up to 8 or 9 for this season. So he's got great stats again, showing how reliable he is from the spot. But even though he was on the end of some rash challenges, ultimately some of them which might have seen him gone off injured, the fact that he was able to overcome that, get revenge by equalising from the spot, even though we still weren't able to hold on to that 1-1 scoreline. Even though that was the case, it was nice to see him obviously get something in the game. Now I suppose another negative, obviously aside from his sideways passing, was actually his corners, or his deliveries from corners. Now this is something which I've said once again, much like Marmite, some of his corners have been great this season, some of them have been less so. And of course this was a game where once again his corners were very disappointing. And that was just purely based on the fact that they couldn't pass the first man. Because if he had just put a little bit more height on it, a little bit more whip on it, it probably would have come into the box. And because Palace, we put people like Tompkins, like Dan in the box, we've got real height in there. Maybe if they had got on the end of it, then maybe we could have had more chances from it. But the fact that all of our corners were quite low, not necessarily that much whip on it, they just easily got cleared by the first man, and that was something that was quite disappointing with our performance. Because when you consider we were just lacklustre in our general play, when we had chances to score or had chances to create goal scoring opportunities from corners, from set pieces, we weren't able to take them, mainly because people like Luca weren't actually putting in deliveries. So whilst his midfield performance was good, breaking up play and just holding on to possession, I think we had something like 62% possession. So whilst we were good in that respect, the corners could have been a little bit better. But like I said already, his passing, his corners, they obviously could have been better. But I've given him a 7 because the fact that he took so many heavy challenges in the first half and he was able to carry on was of course the first thing that impressed me. And of course scoring that penalty, albeit it meant nothing to us in the game because we ended up losing, but the fact that under the pressure he was able to equalise from the penalty spot was of course good to see. So do comment below with your thoughts about his performance. And once again, like I've been saying, saying every week now. Comment below with who you think should partner Luca in the midfield, whether you think Maya should come in there, Kouyaté, Maya should play together, whether Slupp and MacArthur should continue to play together. Obviously do comment below with your general thoughts, but once again, like I said already, going to give Luca a little bit of credit, because in comparison to other players in the field, I do think he was slightly better. So I'm now going to move on to the final player in our midfield, and that is Jeffrey Slupp, who I'm going to give a 6 overall. Now I suppose much like what I talked about in MacArthur, in the fact that Slupp wasn't necessarily terrible in the game, but as the game wore on, he sort of his influence diminished throughout the game, and I suppose that's much the same as MacArthur. Now I'm going to give him a 6 overall because, like I said, I do think there were some parts of the game where he was quite positive. You know, the fact that he found himself in advanced positions, was looking to link up with players like Vanano, like Zahara on the left hand side. So whilst there were some good aspects of his game, and you know, certainly when Palace were looking to get forward, he was looking to get on the ball, but then obviously the other part of his game was much like MacArthur. His sort of influence dwindled as the game went on, and of course ultimately was why people sort of asking why he, you know, should come off, mainly because he was just had that influence that he normally has in the game. He wasn't really having it in this game here. But like I said already, you know, I do think, you know, much the same as what I said with MacArthur could be said about Slupp, in the fact that he was one of the few players who, yes, he wasn't necessarily great throughout the whole game, but in that first half period, certainly in terms of Palace having as much possession as we did, I do think he was involved quite a lot in that. And you know, there was a great chance he had himself to actually rescue a point for us in added time, but of course he blazed that effort high and wide. So whilst there isn't anything of note other than his good play, there isn't anything of note in that first or second half. You know, right at the end of that second half, in added time, had a great chance to rescue a point for us. You know, the ball's come into the box, but of course he blazed his effort high and wide. So a really great chance to get on the score sheet for him once again, but of course to get us back into the game. But of course he couldn't finish it. So for me personally, I do think the 6 is a fair result. You know, a performance where he was good in spells, you know, in terms of, you know, getting into good advanced positions, getting into dangerous areas where of course he can either have chances himself or create chances for himself. And in terms of, even though we weren't that great as a team in terms of our performance, we were quite lacklustre, when we were looking to get the ball forward, I do think Jeffrey Slupp was one of the architects of that, in the fact that he was able to carry the ball from deep and drive forward. So whilst, you know, there isn't really too much to say about him, you know, the one real thing that really is the thing that was probably why people are going to be disappointed with his performance is just the fact that he had a great chance at the end of the game to obviously draw Palace level. Of course didn't take it in added time, and of course, you know, put the effort high and wide. So overall I do think the 6 for Jeffrey Slupp is a fair result. So I'm now going to move on to the first player in our front three, and that is Andros Townsend, who I'm going to give a 6 overall. Now I suppose much the same could be said about Jeffrey Slupp's performance and James MacArthur's performance when you compare it to Andros Townsend's, in the fact that he wasn't necessarily terrible in the game in comparison to some of his other teammates, but of course we could have seen a little bit more from him throughout the game. So I suppose the phrase to use is on the fringes of the game, because he was looking to get involved but couldn't quite have that telling impact that of course he's had over the last sort of month or so. And you know, I suppose one of the main reasons for that is because on a number of occasions he found himself in good positions, much like MacArthur and Jeffrey Slupp, but rather than the other ones, you know, people like Jeffrey Slupp just putting it wide, or you know, people like MacArthur, you know, putting, you know, Zahara through on goal, he didn't finish the chance. Townsend was a little bit different, where he was looking to be the provider, so looking to get, you know, the ball to players in the box, but most of his crosses were overhit. And it was sort of a throwback to when he was playing under Alan Pardew, in the fact that he was looking to cut inside, so everything in the build-up to that was good in terms of getting the ball, driving forward, but then when it came to that final ball, that final little bit of quality, Townsend was a little bit lacking in that respect by obviously overhitting a few of his crosses. So whilst people like MacArthur, like Jeffrey Slupp were getting in good positions, obviously Townsend was doing the same, but his chances, or how he finished it in terms of his end product, was a little bit more disappointing in the fact that he overhit them. And you know, you go back to his form over the last sort of month or so, you know, well, I suppose the last sort of 2 months, so since December coming into January, sort of end of February, he's been in a fantastic run of form. And of course it was a little bit disappointing to see him go back to his old self, where rather than actually putting these shots on target or finding his man inside the box, he actually was just putting it high and wide. So I suppose that's something which is disappointing, disappointment in his performance. But like I said already, I've given him a 6 because the fact that he, even though the whole team was quite lacklustre, the fact that he showed a little bit more than others in the fact that he was looking to get forward, albeit he didn't have the quality in the end by putting the crosses wide, at least he actually had that intent to actually look to go forward. Whereas other players in the team, you know, like Luca, even though I gave him a good rating, he was always sort of looking to pass the ball, you know, sideways. So I suppose in that respect it was a positive from Andros' perspective. Now I suppose there was one attacking situation in particular where he looked to have messed it up. You know, he obviously delayed a shot, but then eventually he won the penalty. So I suppose one of the other reasons I've given him a 6 is that, yes, his good play up until the final ball was good, but actually he also won the penalty for the team, and he obviously looked up to miss it. He looked like he messed up the opportunity, so got the ball into the edge of the area, looking to get inside. Obviously looked like he messed it up, but eventually in doing so, in trying to claim the ball back, he's being fouled, won the penalty, which of course Milivojevic scored. And yes, that brought us back on level terms early in the second half, and yes, that saw Palace actually becoming the ascendancy. But like I've said, because his teammates, because other players around him couldn't take advantage of the chances we had, and really couldn't take real great chance or great, we had loads of possession, so we couldn't really take the positives from that, was of course a little bit disappointing. Now, the thing that really topped of his performance is the fact that he got replaced by Max Meyer, and obviously that was shortly after Brighton had made it 2-1. So once again, I suppose this is something I've been saying, at the beginning of the season, where Roy Hodgson was waiting too late and he was being reactive rather than proactive with his subs. And whilst I don't think Townsend should have come off early on in the game, this sort of sub for me sort of reeked of, now we've gone behind, now we need to bring on some more attacking threat. So if he had done that a little bit sooner, as soon as we got the equaliser, we had the ascendancy, so we should have brought on Max Meyer, should have brought on someone like Chiarte, just to give us that little bit of tenacity, I suppose, a little bit more creativity and energy, just to help us see out the game, as opposed to waiting we've gone behind and then going, actually now let's take Townsend off. And I'm not trying to criticise Roy Hodgson here, because of course his subs, even though they're not great at the minute, they're certainly better in the fact that he's now actually making subs in comparison to the beginning of the season. But still, I would have, even though I don't think this was the case, I think he just wasn't really expecting a goal, so was going to bring Max Meyer on anyway. But I do think it was certainly the case of where he was being reactive. We've just gone down, now is the time to bring on Meyer, where actually I do think that, yes, Townsend was getting in good positions, yes, he was looking to create for his teammates, but of course that final ball wasn't there, so he should have brought on Max Meyer sooner, because he would have continued to get in good positions, and of course would have continued to actually bring that sort of creativity that he's done in the game so far this season. But overall, I do think the 6 is a fair result for Andros Townsend, and much like what I said with Jeffrey Sharp and James McArthur, these are players who, yes, they weren't terrible in the game, but certainly at least were looking to give something to the team by actually getting in good positions. And whilst Townsend was one of these players who didn't necessarily have the end product of it in the performance, which was overall very disappointing from a Palace perspective, and I suppose both teams were quite terrible in terms of our play. No team played fantastic, it was just about the team that wanted it more. And even though that was the case, it was just a little bit disappointing given his recent form, that of course Andros Townsend wasn't able to make the better or make the most of the few chances he did have. So overall, Andros Townsend, I do think he does deserve the 6 I've given him. So I'm now going to move on to the striker in our team, Michy Batshuayi, who I'm going to give a 6 overall. Now I suppose Batshuayi was one of these players who he didn't necessarily get the best of service in the game, but I do think the stuff that he was given, he done a relatively good job with it, and that's why I've given him the 6 overall. Now I suppose the phrase to use is drifting in and out of the game, because that's essentially what he did throughout the game, because there were some periods, certainly early on, where he wasn't necessarily as involved as he would have liked to, but then when Palace were in the ascendancy in parts of the game, when we had loads of possession, he was obviously looking, me looking back at the game, he was actually looking to get on the ball. So I suppose in that respect, it isn't a good thing that he's drifting in and out of the game, but of course it was at least nice to see some good parts of his play throughout the game. Now, in terms of his good parts, just breaking it down, what the things that I personally picked out was the fact that he made quite a number of good touches throughout the game, but of course he wasn't able to get the better of people like Dunk, like Shane Duffy. So whilst his good play revolved around the fact that he was making good touches, bringing the ball down well, linking up with players really well, yes, that was great, but of course he didn't necessarily have that final quality to maybe spin past Dunk or Duffy, or just to at least create a chance in behind them so that other players can get onto it. So I suppose for me, looking back at the game, the reason he drifted in and out of the game is that, yes, when he did get to show bits of quality, he was able to do it, but of course that final end product wasn't quite there, and that's why he was sort of drifting in and out, because he had good build-up play, but then drifted out of the game because he couldn't really add anything further to that. But I suppose, after half-time, he was one of the players who came out a little bit more energised, a little bit more looking like he actually wanted the game, and I suppose that's just because he sort of got inspired at half-time. Whatever was said at half-time, yes, it didn't necessarily improve the whole team in terms of our performance, but certainly Batshuayi in particular was one of these players who seemed to be a little bit more inspired, a little bit better in terms of his play in the second half. Now I suppose, looking at the penalty, yes, obviously ultimately it didn't mean anything because we still lost the game, but in terms of that goal, he was involved in the build-up to that, and obviously he was the guy who was harrying Duffy, obviously making him cause the mistake. brought him down, and that was obviously brought out another chance soon after. So whilst he was obviously involved with the penalty in the build up to that, and that was great to see. But then shortly after that, he was also involved in another great chance where, of course, he was hurrying up the Brighton defence, causing Duffy to make a mistake. And, you know, that created another chance soon after. And yes, nothing came from it, but nevertheless, it's nice to see that good striker work in the fact that he's putting pressure on the back four. And, you know, I do think that if other players in the team, you know, had been playing a little bit more up to standard, you know, if we hadn't have made these silly mistakes at the back, if we hadn't have let, you know, Knockout score from about 20 yards, then maybe we could have had a chance in the game, and we would have been able to capitalise on our sort of ascendancy in the game. But because of the mistakes we made, put us under pressure, and ultimately meant that Batshuayi, yes, he was doing all of that hard work, but maybe that sort of pressure was just too much for him, and the fact that other teammates weren't really helping him, maybe that sort of played his part as well. But I suppose the word I've used, or the phrase I've used quite a lot to describe Jordan Ayew this season, and I'm going to use it here for Batshuayi because I do think it's relatable. It's just the fact that he worked his socks off, because that's exactly what he did. You know, he was chasing balls down, looking to get involved, and that was something that I thought was really positive about his play. The fact that he was actively looking in a performance where the team weren't playing that great, the fact that he was looking to bring that something to the side was of course good to see. But like I've said already, all of that good work is all well and good, but if you don't have the chances, or when you have a chance to finally score your first home goal for Palace, you know, if you don't fully take these chances, or even if you don't have these chances, then of course there's not much you can do. So overall, I do think a 6 overall is a fair result for Batshuayi. You know, yes, he drifted in and out of the game, and maybe not involved as much as he would have liked, but much of the time that he was actually he was drifting in the game, I do think he was involved in quite a lot of Palace's good play, you know, in terms of his touches. But once again, maybe it could be down to the fact that both teams weren't playing that great, but of course we weren't able, Batshuayi in particular, to actually break down Duncan Duffy. We weren't able to get that final ball. So whilst everything Batshuayi was doing in terms of his hold-up play, making good touches, yes, that was all good, but of course that final bit was missing. So overall, I do think the 6 for Batshuayi is a fair result. So I'm now going to move on to the final player in our starting 11, and that is Wilfried Zaha, who I'm going to give a 6 overall. Now, of course, we know all about the history of Zaha and Brighton, and the fact that I think it's 5 goals in his last 9 appearances against them. Now that's going to be 5 goals in 10 appearances against them, and that's just because it was a little bit of an off game here for him. You know, he scored 5 goals in 5 game weeks, and of course, he's in great form coming into this game. But whether it's just the fact that it was the occasion got to him, maybe it's the fact that the rest of the team weren't playing that great, or maybe it's just him not playing that great. Whatever it was, he wasn't quite playing that great. But like I said with Batshuayi, like I've said with quite a few players already, you know, I've given them 6s because they were in spells of the game, they were looking to do the good thing, but of course their real quality that they've shown in previous games was lacking and wasn't quite there. Now, in terms of Zaha's performance, you know, looking at his first half, I think he had quite a fairly slow start to the game, in the fact that we started kick-off, Brighton seemed to be more up for it, but then when Palace started to get into the game, Zaha was a little bit slow to obviously get involved, but, you know, he came into the fore after Palace had gone a goal behind. So, you know, I talked about Roy Hodgson being sort of reacting to conceding goals. I think that was much the same with Zaha, where, you know, he was sort of not playing that great in the game, but as soon as we conceded, he obviously felt or had that impetus to actually try and do whatever he could in the game. So whilst he didn't necessarily have the greatest game, hence why I've given him the 6, it was nice to see him. It was nice to see him that after that slow start to the game, he was able to come out a little bit more and actually, you know, have more influence on the game overall. Now, there was one chance in particular where he looked certain to make it 1-1, but of course Lewis Dunk made a brilliant block, and that was obviously the chance I was talking about, where McArthur had done all of his good work, got the ball in the box, passed to Zaha, and of course Zaha was almost certainly going to make it 1-1. Great chance for him goal, but of course Lewis Dunk made a brilliant block, and that of course denied him the equaliser shortly before the break. And you know, if we had gone in at half time 1-1, maybe it would have been a different story. And you know, if it had been 1-1 and we still had that penalty, 2-1 could have been a completely different story. But the fact that Lewis Dunk made a brilliant block from Zaha was of course a little bit disappointed, but nevertheless, you know, you've got a player who scored 5 goals in 5 game weeks, so it's nice to see him get in a position to score. But of course, you know, it wasn't that great to see that he wasn't able to finish the chance off. Now, of course, Montoya was one of the Brighton players who was booked. I think there were 6 players booked for Brighton, so once again you could clearly see there that their tactics were obviously trying to hit out at will. They were not necessarily him in particular, but people like him, people like Luca, they were trying to make these really, really hard challenges. And of course Montoya was one of these players on a yellow card, and one of the reasons for that is just because, you know, Zaha was given the run around, beating him quite a lot of the time. You know, he was playing at right back, you know, getting the beating of him quite a lot of the time. And, you know, whilst Zaha wasn't able to quite have the impact he would have liked, the fact that he was given Montoya, essentially just giving him the runaround by just running sort of on the outside of him, cutting inside, getting to the byline. He was doing all of the good things, but much like the whole team, that final ball wasn't there. The fact that he was being a little bit too sort of selfish at times, the fact that he was holding on to the ball, that was something which, of course, looking back on, he could have improved on, because we know the quality he's got. We saw, last weekend against Burnley, the fact that he dribbled past 2 or 3 defenders and scored. So he showed he's got that quality to score individual goals. But in this game here against Brighton, a team who are very defensively solid, and the fact that Brighton sort of, I wouldn't say part of the bus, but they put a lot of men in the box. When you've got a team like that, you're not going to be able to take on all the players. So it would have been a little bit nicer for him, when he's got the beating of people like Montoya, to actually get him behind. Would have been nicer to him to provide the ball into the box in the first place. But like I said already, whether it was the occasion got to him, whether it's the fact that the rest of the team weren't great, I do think the 6 is a fair result. And like I've said, there were spells in the game where he was good, some spells where he wasn't, so I do think overall the 6 is a fair result. So I'm now going to go on to the substitutes in the game. Obviously, Max Meyer and Christian Benteke were the 2 subs we made. I'm going to give both of them 5s, mainly because they were brought on to obviously change the game. We were obviously losing 2-1 by this point when they came on. And of course, they were brought on to give us a little bit more impetus, give us that little bit of threat up top to obviously help us get back into the game. And ultimately, neither of them had the impact we would have liked to have seen. Now, of course, Max Meyer came on to take up a position in central midfield. And whilst he was playing in a position where, I talked about Burnley, where he was quite anonymous against Burnley because he was playing out wide. He now got a chance to play in central midfield, but I just think because the rest of the team weren't playing great, because Brighton wanted it more, and just the fact that, for me personally, the damage was already done, and the fact that we were already 2-1 behind. Personally, for me, that's why I think that, he didn't really have the telling impact he would have liked. And, when you consider both Meyer and Benteke came on at the same time, it was a double change. You would have expected them to have this instant impact, bring that impetus to the side, but they obviously couldn't make the difference. Now, in terms of Benteke, he obviously went up top with Michy Batshuayi, so we went to a 4-4-2. And whilst Benteke offered us that presence up top, which of course we had been missing, because, Batshuayi is a player who likes to have the ball to his feet, whereas Benteke, physical presence, likes to have it to his head. And whilst he gave us that presence and he held up the ball quite a lot and held it up really, really well, the fact that he couldn't force the equaliser, he didn't really have the telling impact you would have liked from a striker coming off the bench, was of course slightly disappointing. So whilst it was good in terms of his link-up play, he was holding the ball up well, the fact that he was brought on to help us get back into the game but couldn't provide that little bit of moment of magic or whatever it was to get us back into the game was of course a little bit disappointing. So overall, both Max Meyer and Christian Benteke, not much they could have done in my opinion, because the damage was already done, but it would have been a little bit nicer to see a little bit more from them. But I do think, given their performance, I do think the 5 is a fair result. So now I'm just going to give you a small summary of the game, and like I've said, throughout the podcast, I don't really want to dwell too much on it, because once again, it was a disappointing performance, just because both teams were playing badly, but we were playing much more worse than Brighton were, and of course Brighton on the day wanted it more than us. And I suppose the phrase to use is meh, because essentially that's what the game was. It was a game where, yes, we weren't necessarily terrible like we were at the Amex towards sort of the beginning of the season where we lost 3-1. Yes, we only lost 2-1 and the performance was a little bit better. And it wasn't the fact that we lost because we were playing bad, it was just the fact that we were worse than Brighton, because obviously both teams were playing bad. But like I said, meh is the best way to describe it, because there wasn't really any real quality aside from the goal that Brighton scored. So overall, I do think that's the best way to describe the result. And yes, it wasn't, I suppose the game wasn't necessarily that bad, but the result is bad. And I suppose that's the way you've got to look at it, is that yes, the performance wasn't bad, because in comparison to the opposition, both teams were bad, but the result is the one that hurts. We finally had that chance. We've got the chance to play Brighton in the Premier League, and they've beaten us twice. They've got the double over us this season, which of course is a little bit disappointing. And all that we've got running for us now is the fact that we could either, finish above them in the league, which hopefully we can do that, touch wood, because that's the only thing we've really got left in terms of the rivalry. And of course, secondly, if we do get past Watford, and I suppose, that's going to be a really difficult challenge, but if we do get past Watford, there is a possibility that we play either Millwall or Brighton in the Cup, so maybe we've got potential to play them there. So whilst the game wasn't that bad, the result is really bad. And in terms of this rivalry, in terms of just the pure hatred we have between us and Brighton, we really need to get something else this season to obviously, so we can at least have something to show for that rivalry. Now, we were by far the better team, obviously for when we were in the ascendancy. So in terms of the second half, we were by far the better team. And whilst on the whole game you'll look at it and go, yeah, we were both bad and Brighton were probably better than us. But in the parts of the game where we were playing bad or where we were playing good, in truth, it was just because yes, we were playing good, but because the game just lacked quality and because the wind was a little bit of a nightmare, once again, don't want to blame the wind, but maybe that's a little bit of a nightmare. Maybe that's one of the reasons why we weren't playing that great. So you could look at the stats and say statistically, in terms of when Palace were playing great, we were by far the better team. We had all the chances, we had all the possession. But because throughout the whole game, you look at the full 90 minutes, because there were certain parts of the game where we were lacklustre, where we weren't playing that great, where we made defensive mistakes, that's ultimately what did cost us. And I suppose, you've got to look at the game as a whole and look at players individually, and you've got to look at them and go, actually, at some point in the game, they've got to at least be beaten at the wind or the, a throw-in or whatever. They've at least got to be beaten from it, because that's certainly the theme of the game, where both teams weren't really playing that great. The quality wasn't there, and you've got to look at it and go, quite a few times, players were actually beaten by the flight of the ball. And, you look at Tompkins as a prime example. The ball's flying over him, tried to header it, doesn't do that, and then Murray goes through and score. Now, obviously, the game overall was quite poor, but the reason why it was so poor in terms of our perspective, when we played well in parts, it was just because we were toothless. We weren't ruthless, we weren't toothless, we weren't taking our chances, and that's essentially why we went on to lose the game, because the fact that we didn't take advantage of when we were playing good is ultimately why we went on to lose the game. And, when you look back at the game, you're looking back at the goals, they essentially won it because they wanted it more than us, and they scored two fantastic strikes. The first one, yes, ultimately was a little bit of luck, but the volley, hit it on the volley, was obviously, good skill and why it's good. And of course, the second one is a great ball cut inside. Can't really do anything about that, other than the fact that we shouldn't have allowed him to get into that position in the first place. So, yes, it was a poor game overall, and one of the reasons why we were playing bad is just because when we were in a good period of the game, we weren't toothless, and like I've said already, it was two fantastic strikes, which of course went to see us lose. And like I said, once we went behind, we reacted, we looked the better team, but we just had no answer, because Brighton were just putting players behind the ball, congesting the box in their own half, and especially their own half, in their penalty box in particular. Because they were doing that, it basically restricted our movement. Our passing was obviously poor off the back of that. We were trying to break them down, but we just kept giving the ball away. So there's obviously loads of reasons why we lost the game. Brighton wanted it more, we didn't take our chances, they took their chances. But ultimately, you've got to look at it as well and go, Brighton were quite happy to sit defensive, sit really deep, and because they'd done that, it restricted our movement because we couldn't break them down, made our passing bad because we were trying to do stuff to break them down. They just intercepted it, and essentially that's what sort of prevented us from getting any openings on the game. And I suppose, you're looking at the game overall, looking at the quality or the lack of quality from both sides, you'll probably say on the balance, a draw probably would have been the right result. You're looking at the stats, you're looking at the game, you're looking at the goals, maybe a draw would have been the right result. But the fact that we just failed to stretch them, we failed to create clear opportunities, we created chances, we had shots, but because we didn't create clear ones, ultimately that's why we went on to lose the game. And I suppose moving away from the performance here, this was obviously disappointing, and of course, if we lose this, the only thing really we've got left in terms, is finishing above Brighton in the league and actually getting through the FA Cup, so we can, sort of get a round further than them or play them in the next round. So that just moves me on to my next point, is the fact that, yes, this is disappointing, but we need to really pick ourselves up. We can't dwell on this, even though as much as it hurts, as much as we hate it losing to Brighton, we've got a massive game against Watford in the FA Cup next weekend. We win that, we go to Wembley, and that's how big it is. So whilst it's really annoying, really depressing that we lost to Brighton, we've got an even bigger match where if we win that, we go to Wembley, and we're that close to the final. So we need to really brush this aside and think about it and reflect on it, going, next time we play Brighton, if we play them next season, touch wood, if both teams don't get relegated, we need to just make sure that we can actually, rectify our mistakes and actually play better than we did on the day. But like I've said, we've got a really big game against Watford at the weekend, and hopefully we can put in a good performance, put out a really strong team, hopefully touch wood, gets in the next round, and essentially that will not necessarily completely make up for it, but it will make up ever so slightly for this result against Brighton. So I'm now going to move on to the Man of the Match award. But before I do that, I give you my Man of the Match. Now, I thought the biggest influence in the game. I'm now going to give you the 3 nominations I put forward for the award. Now, when you consider it was quite a disappointing game for Palace, well, I say disappointing, it was a completely sort of disastrous game in the fact that we lost to our rivals, and of course the performance wasn't really there to back up anyway. So overall, really disappointing performance overall, and to be honest, it's really hard to put it into words. So in terms of the Man of the Match, it was actually quite difficult, considering the mood after the game, to actually pick a player, let alone 3 players, which I've done here, managed to narrow it down to 3 players, because quite honestly the performances across the field were quite lacklustre, and whilst as you've seen in the player ratings, whilst some players weren't necessarily terrible, we were just as bad as Brighton were at times in the game. We couldn't break them down. They were just hitting us on the break but couldn't finish their chances, and it was essentially just a really poor quality game. Brighton took their chances, we didn't, and essentially they wanted it more than us, so overall a really disappointing performance. But in terms of the 3 players I've gone with Aaron Wan-Bissaka, James McArthur and Luka Milivojevic. Obviously I'm recording this late, so once again forgive me for any mistakes. Now in terms of Wan-Bissaka's performance, once again outstanding, and one of the only real players who actually showed quality throughout the whole game. Obviously the 2 other players in McArthur and Milivojevic showed glimpses of their brilliance, and in other parts of the game they were quite lacklustre, but Wan-Bissaka throughout the whole game was consistently good. Saw lots of the ball down the right hand side, was looking to get involved, and in terms of most of Palace's good play, he was involved in that, and particularly sort of in that first half where I would say that the final ball was lacking, but still Wan-Bissaka was looking to get involved. So once again, going back to the team performance not being good, Wan-Bissaka was one of the players who actually was one of the better players in the team. Now in terms of the second half, made 2 important vital challenges in particular to obviously stop Brighton attacks, and that's essentially what we know from Wan-Bissaka, but it was nice to see him against the rivals put it in there, because when you've got considered the rest of the team were playing subpar, you need players like Wan-Bissaka to actually step up and make things count, because if he hadn't have made these few challenges, a few blocks, things like this, winning back possession, then maybe Brighton could have had more joy. So the fact that the rest of the team were playing bad but he made up for it was of course good to see. Now in terms of James McArthur, he was one who I was sort of deliberating whether or not to put him in here, but actually I do think in that first half, of course we went 1-0 down, but I do think McArthur was one of our more positive players, full of running, looking to get in good positions, playing in advanced roles, and actually there were one chance in particular where he could have recorded an assist for Zaha. Obviously he looked to set him up for the equaliser, obviously just before the half time, but of course a brilliant block prevented that from Brighton. So whilst McArthur didn't necessarily have the greatest game in terms of comparing his performance to other players in the team, I'm going to give him a bit of credit because he was full of running, because he was looking to actually do something, whereas other players were always passing sideways. McArthur was looking to go forward, and that was something that did impress me. And obviously that chance in particular for Zaha where he put him through, that of course was a really good one. And then himself, on a stroke of half time, had a shot himself, or had an effort himself, obviously deflected behind for a corner. So not only was he creating chances, but also he was taking chances himself. Now in terms of Milivojevic's performance, obviously Luke has come up for a little bit of criticism, mainly because his sideways passing and his corners weren't necessarily that great, but the fact that he got Palace's only goal in the game is why I'm going to give him credit. A massive derby game, bring it back to 1-1, and of course there was a lot of pressure on him taking a penalty, and yes, we did go on to lose the game, but nevertheless having that pressure to take the penalty is obviously a really good thing. And I do think that actually, even though he was passing sideways quite a lot, I do think his defensive side of his work was certainly much better than his forward play. So whilst you've got someone like McArthur playing very far forward and looking to create chances, Luka was sitting very deep, making challenges, making blocks. And when you consider he took 2 or 3 really, I wouldn't say really bad fouls, but he took really hard fouls, which probably could have seen him being taken off with an injury. So the fact that he took these knocks, carried on the game, and yes, his corners and his sideways passing were the negative of his game, but taking that penalty to equalise whilst also putting in a good defensive performance is obviously why I'm going to give him credit. So of course comment below with who you would have put forward for the Man of the Match award. Personally for me, I don't really think anyone really deserves credit because it was such a disappointing performance, and I suppose even though I've nominated 3 players, I think the one player who I think is sort of exempt from any criticism is Aaron Wan-Bissaka. So congratulations Aaron, you win this week's Man of the Match award for the game against Brighton. And essentially just because of how good he was defensively, making these blocks, making these challenges, making interceptions is why I've given it to him. And whilst the other 2 were good in James McArthur and Luka Milivojevic, I just think that Wan-Bissaka was just consistently good throughout the game, whereas both McArthur and Milivojevic had good spells and bad spells. So obviously comment below with what you think, but like I've said already, such a disappointing performance, so it's really difficult for me to actually narrow it down to 3 players, let alone I normally do 4, so the fact that I've only got it to 3 just goes to show the quality and the poor quality of the game overall. So now you've heard my match report, player rankings and my Man of the Match. That concludes this week's podcast. Now I've got interviews with Roy Hodgson, Luka Milivojevic and Aaron Wan-Bissaka following the game.
How frustrated you after that game today?
Well, okay, I cannot say it's frustrated, but we are disappointed because I think we were a better team over 90 minutes. We push a lot, we try, we create. I think that's what we did today, but in the end they had 2 shots. They were very lucky to score from the 2 shots, and in the end they got 3 points. I think they didn't deserve, to be honest. We deserve more from this game, but that's football. What you can do.
Can you put your finger on why the team are getting better results away from home than at home?
I cannot give some good explanation, but it just happened. You know, for us it's much better when we play at home, in front of our fans. It's much easier for us, but at the moment we pick a lot of points out of away from home. And what we can do, you know, we're gonna try to. You know, it's happened because if you see this game today, you cannot say that we didn't play well or we didn't want or they beat us. No, they played very deep. They defend over 90 minutes. I think we create enough to get some points from this game, but in the end, that's football. And you know, I cannot say now we have problem at home or it's easier away. No, it's not. It's much easier at home, of course, but at the moment the results show different.
And finally, how painful was that? It looked like you had quite a few tackles on you today.
Yeah, they start from beginning to play strong, to tackle a lot. That's the football. They decide to play that way, and what we can do, we have to adapt. We have tackle as well, and we try to play with possession, to try to find our front players with the passing. They try, of course, to cut that, and you know, in the end, it was one tough game. But as I said, we are very disappointing, especially because of our fans. This game, we know how much this game means for them. But what we can do, I think we do everything to try to make them happy. But today, they were so lucky.
And unlucky today in the derby. What do you feel the team deserved more from the game?
Yeah, definitely. You know, obviously it wasn't a great start to the first half, but as you could see in the second half, we stepped our game up and created a lot of chances.
How tough did the wind make it today, defending?
It was quite difficult, you know, whether to judge airplay, you know, to time your jump, but that's conditions that we can't really change, so we've got to play with it.
Do you think that had a factor on the first goal at all when it came through to Tonks?
Yeah, of course. You know, you could just tell. You know, I'm confident with Tonks in them situations, but you know, the wind played against him, so.
And Glenn Murray came in at the last minute. Did that affect anything at all in terms of your preparation for set pieces?
No, you know, we prepared for him to play or not. You know, so our aim was just to try to defend well with the set plays.
And it must have been good, I mean, to score straight after half-time with that penalty. Did you feel at that point that you'd get some momentum and maybe get a win? Yeah,
definitely, and I think that showed. You know, after the penalty, we stepped our game up a bit.
It was a wonder goal from them, wasn't it, for the winner?
Yeah, it was, you know, it's a great finish, but at the same time, I think we could have prevented that. But at the same time, we'll learn from that to make it better in the next game.
So is it a case of we've got Watford next up in the FA Cup, time to put this behind us as quick as possible?
Yeah, of course, you know, and we'll learn from our mistakes from this game and put it right against Watford.
You've had a lot of the ball, you've had a lot of the chances, you come away from a derby game with nothing. That's going to be hard to take, Roy.
Yeah, it's a hard defeat to take, but we came across a team that got players behind the ball, you know, defended their penalty box very well. We gave it our best effort. We certainly couldn't be accused of not trying hard enough to get that goal. We pushed players forward at all times. We, as you rightly say, had an awful lot of possession. We had the corner kicks and the free kicks, but of course a mistake caused by the swirling wind set them up for their first goal, which was well taken. And then, of course, the second goal, which wins them the game, is really an outstanding shot from just outside the box. Those type of goals that win the goal of the month or the goal of the year competitions. So it's hard to take. I don't think we can honestly say we deserve to not get anything from this game. But on the other hand, we've got to say that Brighton worked very hard for their victory.
Are you exasperated with the fact that Knockout was allowed to roll in and get that shot away?
Well, he didn't roll in. I mean, he moved it across. Patrick Van Aanholt. We had players closing him down. It was just a wonder strike, really.
You got back into the game at 1-1. At that stage, really, you could only see one winner, couldn't you?
Yeah, we thought if we got back in the game at 1-1, especially early on, that we would go on because we had, such a dominance of possession, and we are always dangerous up front. Wilf was having an exceptionally good game and was asking lots of questions. So the second goal, a bit like the first goal, really, it came like an enormous cold shower. At a time when you're not thinking that this is going to happen to you, it does. But at 2-1 with only 18 minutes left to play, you knew it was going to be tough because they're an experienced team, and you knew that every time the ball went out of play, it was going to take a while to come back in again.
I know it's a fiercely fought derby game, but in a way, a point apiece would have suited you both where you are in the table. But do you think where you are now, you are in danger, or do you think you've got enough with the games to come?
Well, I'd like to think we've got enough in terms of the quality that we have in the team to start, but of course we missed a great opportunity. I mean, the expectations on us were high. Sometimes when the expectations mount, we don't deal with them as well as we would like to see the team deal with them. This was an opportunity today to really move ourselves away from any real fear of relegation and even start looking upwards in the table. But we missed the chance. We didn't take it. We didn't win the game. We lost the game. So as a result, of course, now we are going to have a close look behind us again, which is disappointing after taking 6 points in the last week.
Finally, games have been won and lost over the 300 you've had as an English League manager, and I'll take you back to that day in January of '82 at Ashton Gate. I was there that day. I was only 7, and it was a long, long time ago. But so many things have happened to you over the years, right? Wonderful things, really.
Yes, I suppose you're right. Although I'm not really thinking in those terms at the moment. I'm thinking in terms of how bitterly disappointed I am to lose this game. I know it's an important game for the club, an important game for the supporters. I don't think that we can be accused of not putting in every ounce of effort to win it, but we didn't win it, and as a result, Brighton go home really, singing and dancing, and we go home really bemoaning our fate and feeling very sorry for ourselves.
So there you have it. Now you've heard what Roy Hodgson, Luka Milivojevic and Aaron Wan-Bissaka had to say after the game. That concludes this week's podcast for the game against Brighton. But make sure to come in next week from a post-match review of the game against Watford in the FA Cup. So thanks for listening, and remember to up the Palace.